Well, good morning. Just love the lines to that song, but even the one before, how it says that song, above all, how you took the fall. And I know Joe and I were talking about superhero movies coming out this week and, superheroes that are out there. But, of all the religions out there, there really is only one where the founder of the religion was willing to prove how much he loved our race by dying for our race. And of course, he's the only one that rose up from the grave, showing he has the power over death. So if you ask me which one's worth following, it's really not rocket science. We follow the King who loved us enough to die for us and showed that he has power over death. So call me crazy, but until I die, I'm going to follow Jesus. All right, just give me a minute here to get set up, and hopefully my computer will help me. And if you have a Bible, you can open it up. We're going to be in Matthew 28. Maybe. Well, you got to love technology. Oh. Okay. I think we're good now. Last words. Last words are important, aren't they? I don't know how many of you guys have a loved one that you were privileged to be with and got to hear some of their last words. But they're seldom rushed. They're always important. And, if you think about it, they're almost always something that's deeply coming from the person's heart. They're not going to be, we'll make sure you close the garage door, and it's not going to be that kind of thing. It's going to be the things that are really, really on their heart. So if you look at the gospel accounts, after Jesus rose from the dead, according to the writings that his followers wrote, and he kind of harmonized them. They each give pictures, their remembrances of his last words before he went up into heaven. And if you look at the Gospel of Mark and Luke and Acts, they all talk about, they all basically say Jesus said, the gospel, the good news about my death and my resurrection will be preached to all people groups. That will happen before he comes back, he said. And he told them in one account, he says, you are my witnesses. In the other account, he says, you will be my witnesses. So the gospel was there. And then if you look at the book of Matthew, Matthew records the last command given to the disciples as this one, and we'll read it up on the screen. Go and disciple all the people groups, okay? So we know the gospel was on Jesus' heart, and we know that discipling people who respond to the gospel was on Jesus' heart, okay? And we know from history, he went up into heaven, and these 12 men, that's basically what they used their whole lives to do. They went out, they preached the gospel city by city, and they discipled people who responded, okay? I'll give you a sample of that from the book of Acts, chapter 14, verse 21. This is a man who is called, we're not all called specifically to be evangelists, where our whole career is to be dedicated to the gospel. This is a man who was, although we all can share the gospel. But Paul went from city to city, and this is talking about his time in the city of Derbe. This was his first missionary journey, and it says Paul and Barnabas, it says they in your text, but if you read the context, it's Paul and Barnabas. They preached the gospel in that city and discipled many people, okay? Same exact word used in Matthew 28. For some reason, the new NIV, which I have, has the word, they won many disciples, and that's completely unjustified in the Greek. There's no word win. It just simply says they discipled many people. So we see the followers of Jesus doing what he said. They went out, preached the gospel, they discipled a whole lot of people, and then it says he went on to the next city, which had been a couple cities he had just come from, Lystra, where he'd just been stoned. He goes back to that city, talk about bravery. And it says, what does he do there? He strengthens the disciples. Okay, he had obviously made some disciples in that city. He strengthens the disciples there, encourages them to remain true to the faith. It says we must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God. And then it says the last thing he does is he appoints elders for them. For who? For the disciples. He appoints elders for them in each church. So the churches were communities, local communities of people who responded to the gospel and were discipled. And he puts elders over those churches in each churches. So they did it. The disciples went out and they did what Jesus told them to do. Shared the gospel, discipled people who responded, got churches set up so they could continue to be fed and nurtured with elders appointed over them, and then they'd move on to the next city and come back sometimes and just strengthen and encourage the disciples, the local churches there. So my question is this: what do you suppose those churches were supposed to continue to do after the 12 disciples left them? And it's not very complicated. Obviously, they were to continue to share the gospel where they lived and even beyond, and to disciple people who responded, and maybe bring them into their local church, or if they were in another town, maybe plant churches in that area. So we were to continue to share the gospel and make disciples, but somehow through the centuries and today, some churches have gotten off track. Today, most churches, and I've been all over the world, most churches still share the gospel, and then what they do is they do church together for the rest of their lives. And somehow we omit the discipleship step, either because it takes too long, seems too complicated, or I think more often the case is we just honestly don't know how. So my encouragement to us, my challenge is it's time to get back on track. Jesus wants his regular, non-clergy followers to be using their lives, sharing the gospel as God opens doors, as they have opportunities, 1 Peter 3, always be prepared. And number 2, discipling people who have already responded to the gospel. If we're not, and this is my question to us as a church family, if we, now I'm talking just about Temple Baptist Church, everything was general, but now I'm getting specific. If we as a church aren't ready and willing to disciple people once they respond to the gospel, why should God send us people who are going to get saved and respond to the gospel? I'm definitely not God, but if I was God, I would send them to a church who's ready to disciple them once they get saved, because I don't want them falling through the cracks. Does that make sense? So in our churches, collectively, all the churches, Rockford, all the churches around the world, and individually, each of us individually, just like each of these guys, Paul, Silas, if we're disciples of Jesus, we have a responsibility to keep a mindset for intentionally, explicitly discipling other people that need to be discipled. So over the next few weeks, we're going to try to reclaim some lost ground, maybe not for the church around the world, but for this little church, and maybe it'll spread to Rockford. And I just encourage you to join me in seeking a discipleship revival, first in your own heart, okay, and then in this church family, and then hopefully the rest of Rockford. And my prayer is really for my entire generation. So today, week 1 is discipling people uncluttered. So simple, even a caveman could do it. Week 2 is discipling people in practice. Some chains get broken. And then week 3 will be discipling people at Temple, and I'll issue the 2018 TBC MCF Discipleship Challenge. So this is our 2017 Discipleship Revival Series, and I can't wait to dive in and start. So here we go. Today's lesson is discipleship uncluttered. So simple, even a caveman could do it. And what we're going to talk today about is the only 3 required pieces of discipling someone the way that Jesus said we have to. Okay, if you've got your note sheet, it's got that little squiggle on it. That squiggle represents the discipleship squiggle, and that's what it means to disciple someone. And you see how many boxes are in that thing? There's only 3, okay? Oops, okay, don't pat my pocket. Duly noted. There's only 3. And we're going to get to those. Just one thing I want to say before we get to those. First of all, before you disciple somebody, they have to be ready, okay? Obviously, first they have to hear the gospel, Okay, that makes sense. You know, disciple somebody who's hasn't put their faith in Jesus as Savior. That's the only way, you know, their soul can be saved and they'll be open to discipleship. So they have to be ready, but not only do they have to have heard the gospel and responded, they have to put their faith in Jesus. Say, yeah, I do believe he rose from the dead. He is Lord, okay? But it's more than that. You know, the last time I preached, we did a sermon. Anybody remember the name of it? It was a long time ago, and I won't be offended if you don't. It was 2 words, and it came from the gambling realm. It was it was called All In. Yeah, and it was just an exposition of Luke 14. Luke 14, that passage in, I think it's the end of Luke 14, just 15 verses or so, where Jesus has crowds, and he just turns to them and is very, very, he just lays it down. He says, unless you're willing, you remember some of the things he says, you know, unless you're willing to basically put me, your relationship with me, above every other relationship in your life, your mother, your father, he talks about brothers, the closest relationships you have. If I don't come first, his words are, you cannot be my what? Disciple. Yeah, he used that word disciple. He didn't say you can't be a believer in me, but he uses the word disciple there. And he says, unless you're willing to put me above everybody else, disciple is not a title you can have yet, okay? And then the next thing he says is, unless you're willing to take up your cross, you have to be willing to die, he says, or you cannot be my what? Disciple. Yeah, and then the last thing he says, I mean, if that wasn't enough to, you know, get people off the bandwagon that were just on the bandwagon for the heck of it, you know, he says, unless you're willing to give up, unless you give up everything that you have, you cannot be my, what was the word? Yeah. So for some reason, I don't know what, and I don't have this all figured out. Jesus is the teacher, you know what I mean? I'm just a servant. But this word disciple to him, it meant something. Is that clear at least? That if, you know, you can't just slap that title on yourself lightly, disciple. So the summary, the name of that sermon I called it was All In, and I think that's just a summary of those 3 kind of things that he says. Basically, I think Jesus' point is, to be a disciple, you got to be all in. And I think our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world, particularly the Middle East, experience that when he said that, you have to be all in if you're going to do this thing. There was reason for that, because it wasn't just metaphor, you know, that you have to be willing to die. In a lot of parts of the world, they do die if people become aware of their allegiance to Jesus. So people have to be ready. But if, you know, you have somebody, you share the gospel, they respond, and maybe immediately they want to be all in. I mean, they just, you know, they understand the requirements that Jesus talked about, that, hey, people might hate you if you become a follower of Jesus. You know, they might hurt you, they might, you know, all the things Jesus says. If they come to that point when they're all in, then you can disciple them. But if they're not ready for that yet, that's okay. You know, for me, the time when I became a believer, the gap between that time and the time when I was ready, I think, to become a disciple was about 10 years. And probably it's like that for all of us. I know some people, they become Christians in some of these other countries especially, and they're all in because the second they became a believer, they knew they might have died right from the get-go. So, but, you know, for me, I know it was about 10 years, and it was getting to know this Jesus and study and have some. I didn't have all my questions answered when I responded to the gospel. I had questions, you know. I wanted to know a lot of things, and that's how it is. So even if a person's not ready to be discipled yet, you can still help them along as a new believer. So, for instance, they might need to learn how to pray. Maybe nobody's ever taught them how to pray. I had never prayed before. You know, that wasn't something from my history. You know, maybe they don't even know the attributes of God. You know, it's good basic things to start with. How to study the Bible. They might not know any of those things. Basic things for a new believer that we all need. And it might be years before they're ready and they've had all their questions answered, and this little budding faith in Jesus now, it's stronger, you know. And sometimes that takes time before they're ready to say, you know what, I'm now at the point where I believe this man so much now that I'd be willing to die for him, and I want to make him number one in my life. I want my whole life, I want him to be number one. When they're at that point, then Jesus says that's the point where I think that word disciple can be used to that person. They can be his disciple. And then it's time for them to get discipled. But once they're ready, when a believer in Jesus is ready to be all in and give their entire life to following Jesus, that's the desire of their heart, they're ready to be discipled. And what do we do for them? And that's what I submit to you. Discipling somebody is super simple. Only 3 components. So simple, even a caveman can do it. All right. So now, what are these 3 required components And how do I know that you're not just making these up? Well, here's how you can know. Jesus, when he told them to disciple people, he used a specific word. And it was a very clear word that has very clear components of what it meant. The word was mathetevo. I have the English transliteration there, mathetevo. So Jesus said, you guys, I've mathetevoed you. You guys go and you mathetevo all the people groups. That's what he told them to do. All right. So all we have to do to know the requirements of discipling someone is learn what this word meant in that time period. Okay? Well, first of all, the word, that verb, was a transitive verb. And don't worry, I've got a degree and a grad certificate in linguistics, and I'm not going to bore you with that. But a transitive verb just means a verb that has a subject and an object. It's a verb that one person does for another person. So, for instance, pick. John picked Sally. Picked is a transitive verb. So mathetevo is done when one person mathetevos another person. Okay, I'm not giving you what it means yet. I'm just showing you it's a verb that one person does for another person. One human being mathetevos another person. Transitive verb, okay? So, for instance, the Pharisees mathetevoed other men. Okay? John the Baptist, these are times this word is actually used in the Bible and in literature. The Pharisees mathetevoed people. John the Baptist mathetevoed men, handful of men. Greek skilled men would mathetevo individuals. Okay? So it's a kind of action that one person or a small group of people, like Paul and Silas did it together, mathetevos another individual or group of people. Okay? It's something one person or one human, does for somebody else. That's what I want you to understand. Okay. Now for the components of meaning. First of all, well, you guys know my background's in linguistics. I had no plans to become a pastor, okay? I expected I'd spend my entire life in Africa helping with the global Bible translation work. That was what all my training was towards, and God surprised me in 2012 by calling me to become a pastor. But all my training was in that. I'm in seminary. I'm working on a master's with an emphasis in discipleship now. But my background's in languages, specifically in New Testament Greek, and my subspecialty was componential analysis, which is a really boring thing that just means breaking words down into their individual components of meaning. It's a linguistic science. And linguists do it for every language and all kinds of words, and most of the time it's super boring. So that's my background, okay? I'm kind of a nerd. And I've done this. I have literally thousands of pages on my computer and files of breaking words in the New Testament down into their components of meaning. Most of them are super boring. You wouldn't even want to read them, but that's what somebody does when they're going to spend their whole life as an exegete in Bible translation. So this word, the crazy thing about mathetevo that I find, it's a really hot topic today in the churches, and I love that. You can Google books on discipleship. There's lots of them. And I read the author's definition of what it means to disciple someone, to mathetevo someone. And I have not, to this day, read anybody. First of all, they all have their own meanings of what it means. Gradually helping someone, da-da-da-da-da. And so they each have their own definition of what it is, and I don't see any of them going back to actually the word that Jesus used and looking up what did that word mean, So my big emphasis today is when it comes to what it means to mathetevo somebody, this is my plea, we can't just make up our own definition of what that means, okay? Jesus used a specific word, and we have to use the definition that word had in its time period. Does that make sense? Okay, so this word, mathetevo, I've looked up every single occurrence of this word, not just in the Koine period. Yeah, I'm a super nerd. In the entire classical period, everything. Anytime that this word is in literature, I've looked it up. The good thing is it's only about 36 times. It's a quite rare verb. It's much rarer than something like didasko, to teach, the general word to teach, which occurs thousands of times. Mathetevo had an extra component, an interesting component added to it that made it different than just teaching somebody. And Jesus picked this word. He picked a rare word. And so I think it's worth looking at. All right, so what are the three components that this word has? Number one, okay, it has just two components of meaning. Mathetevoing someone involves two things. Number one, and you could fill this in your blank, teaching someone for a period of time. Teaching someone for a period of time. Okay? Number two, mathetevoing someone involves sharing life with that person for that period of time. That's it. So books on discipleship should be really short. Just teaching them and sharing your life with them as you teach them. In English, I don't know that we really have a good word for that, but can you see how it's more than just teaching someone? It's not just a classroom lesson, and we'll see you next week. It's kind of something like our English, we have an English word, apprenticeship, you know? An apprenticeship is kind of like, you know, it's not classroom learning. You're kind of alongside the person as you're teaching them. That's probably one of the closest concepts in English that we have to this. So, when a Greek young man wanted to become a disciple of, say, a famous public speaker like Isocrates, he discipled men, and that's the kind of words, this is the words that were used for this. When a Greek young man wanted to be discipled by Isocrates, you know what he did? He went and lived with Isocrates for that period of time. He shared life with him, and he was taught something by that person. That's it. Okay? So, and that person was called the disciple of Isocrates. So discipling somebody was not at all limited to religious usage. It simply involved teaching somebody something while interweaving your life with them for a period of time, your disciple. All right, I've got some examples, and we're going to just rip through these. There's my discipleship squiggle. Example number one, and these are times in literature where this word actually occurs, okay? I don't want to just make up my own definition to discipleship. This is the times when mathetevo actually was used in history. Isocrates mathetevoed Ephorus, okay? In this case, Isocrates wasn't a Christian. He was a famous, he was a skilled, a professional public speaker. And so he discipled Ephorus how to be a really good public speaker. And Ephorus lived with him during that period. He taught him while sharing his life with him for a period. Okay, example number two. Sophilus, and I couldn't find a picture of Sophilus online, so if you recognize that guy, it's not a coincidence. Sophilus discipled Antiphon. And in this instance, it was a public speaking discipleship. So he was teaching, what was he teaching? He was teaching public speaking. But he was teaching him while sharing life with him. The Pharisees discipled other men. And they weren't teaching them, the content of their teaching wasn't public speaking, it was how to be a Pharisee, you know. And then Jesus in the literature is said to have discipled Judas, Peter, John, Matthew. I think you guys recognize those names. Of course, it didn't take with Judas, but he did disciple Judas. He shared life with him, and he taught him. Okay, so when Jesus gave his commission, this was the word he used. You guys, he said, I want you to go and you mathetevo all the people groups. And these are the only two things that would have come to their mind when he used that word. They would have been thinking, okay, you want us to teach people and share life with them, you know. Now, we're just fishermen, okay? We don't have Bible degrees. And, you know, you've taught us a whole lot of things. And they probably would have been pretty nervous. I mean, just think of all the stuff Jesus had taught them. And they're thinking, we got to go teach and kind of share life with other people. And, you know, we're not teachers. None of them were trained teachers like Jesus was, you know. But those are the only two components that would have come to mind when they heard that word mathetevo that Jesus said. And you might be wondering, well, how come there's a third box in our sheet? And you're telling us there's only two, and you're so adamant about that, and we got a third box. Well, there is a third component. It's not required by this verb mathetevo, though. Mathetevo only requires those two components. But when Jesus gave his commission to those 12, he added on a couple other details. He didn't just stop, go and disciple all people groups, right? The sentence goes on, and he adds two participles. Those are two supporting verbs in Greek that are dependent on this disciple verb. So he's basically two things I want to be a part of this disciple-making process. And what does he say? He says, you go and disciple them. Go and disciple all the people groups. And what did he say next? Baptizing them. See that ing? It shows it's a support verb. Okay, it modifies the word disciple. So you guys go disciple people, and I want you to baptize them. Now, baptism was not a required part of this verb mathetevo. Okay? Discipling someone did not require baptizing them. Just required teaching them and sharing life with them. But Jesus says, when you guys disciple people, I want baptism to be a part of it. Okay? And Christians have done this through the century. And specifically, he says, I want it to be in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. And then what other thing did he say to them in that commission? Okay, so that's how you get your third component. That's baptism, baptizing them. And that's for Christian discipleship. Okay? And that's it for the three components, but he does give one more detail. In case they were a little overwhelmed, what are we supposed to teach these guys? You know, Jesus, you've taught us a lot of things. You've taught us about the end times. You've taught us parables about the kingdom. You've taught us about people's hearts, the soil, and you've taught us how to live life, some practical things, when you pray, do this. You've taught us a lot of stuff. What do you want us to teach? All of it? We got to pass on all of it, to the people that we disciple? And, well, he seems to highlight one thing in particular that he wants them to be sure they teach. And what is it? Teaching them what? To obey. And what does he say? Teach them to obey everything that I've commanded you. So, Pastor Bill made a good point that the commands are not the bulk of the Bible. The commands in the Bible represent maybe 5% of its total content, and same in the New Testament, But Jesus says, when it comes to our disciples, when you're discipling someone, you don't have to be a Bible scholar, okay? Some people are called to teach the whole counsel of God, pastors and teachers, but everybody can disciple someone. And when it's discipling someone, he says, what I want you to teach them is teach them the practical stuff, okay? How to live life. That's what people need. That's what people my age in the world that are trying to follow Jesus need. We don't know how to live life, and Jesus has given incredible instructions, and we need someone older to show us what it looks like. There's instructions in the New Testament and out of the mouths of Jesus for just about every relationship you could possibly encounter, in every situation you could encounter, there's a principle. And that's what he says they need to learn. So, that's it. No degree needed. No formal theological training needed. Just teach them the New Testament principles for living life, the commands, and share life with them. And if they haven't been baptized, get them baptized. So simple, even a caveman could do it. In the upcoming weeks, we'll build upon this. But when it comes to that caveman, I wouldn't want to be the first one he practices on, I'll be honest. So next week will be, did they actually do it? And we'll look at discipleship chains in history. And I can't wait for that. So Pastor Bill is going to come and lead us in another thing Jesus told us to do before he died.